live anytime soon. Okay, Chris, I'm just going to make you the host, okay?
Yeah, you can. Then I can share my presentation with you.
Okay. All right, your host.
Right, thanks very much, Carl. Okay.
Make you the host, okay?
Yeah, you can. Then I can share my presentation. Yeah. See, it's still saying that I'm not the host. Maybe it's just taking. All right, there we go. Perfect. Just taking a bit of time to feed through. Right. Just set myself up here. And 1 second. Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for asking me to come and have a chat to you about sort of nutrition. So it's a very large topic, and so I just thought I'd sort of focus on one area, and that's around protein and energy balance, because basically protein does help you. Your protein intake can have an impact on your energy balance, as in how many calories you end up consuming. So a bit of an introduction about myself. So as you said, I am a sports physician. I'm currently the club doctor for Charlton Athletic women's football team as well. I'm a GP, and I'm a what's called a certified lifestyle medicine physician. So just so you know, that qualification is quite heavily weighted towards nutrition. Then obviously when I did my master's in sports exercise medicine as well, there's an initial nutritional component to that. And then also increasingly as a GP, I'm finding that a lot of benefit can be had from trying to encourage patients to sort of take up sort of dietary interventions for management of things like type 2 diabetes and that so forth. So so the areas I'm going to kind of cover. Oh, 1 second. There we go. Just a brief these are the areas, a brief overview of body composition, just so you get a feel of like what the body is made up of. Then we're going to talk about protein, and these are sort of broadly the areas we're going to discuss. So, why eat it, talk a little bit about sort of kind of protein physiology, quite high level stuff, but I think it's kind of nice to know about these things. Gives you a bit more of understanding, about why you might be eating this particular protein and so forth. So then amino acids, which are basically the building blocks of all proteins in our body. And there's sort of broadly two types, essential, non-essential. There's a bit more behind that. Then how much do we eat? How much should we eat? And where do you get your protein from? Just that's more about where you can go look for resources to find out about the protein content and things like that. And then when to eat. So there's a little bit about that. And then the second part of the talk, so I thought maybe I'll just stop there and we could ask some questions about that bit. And then the second part's around energy balance. And one of the reasons why I threw this in is there was a very interesting study that happened last year that just basically didn't get enough media coverage. And it really talks quite strongly around sort of weight management and how you maintain your calorific intake. And one of the things, it's not the study itself didn't focus on it, but it sort of highlighted something called the protein leverage hypothesis, which is one of the ideas around there about weight maintenance. So the protein leverage hypothesis basically says that you will continue to consume food until you've hit your required protein intake for the day. So that's basically what that is. So body composition. Essentially, the vast majority of what we are is actually water. So this particular study said 55% water, but some other places it goes up to 65. But ballpark gives you a rough idea. And the next main constituent of our cells is protein. So obviously it's quite a fundamental sort of a macronutrient to think about. Now this is another way of looking at your body composition. So this is, if you look in sort of textbooks around sort of health, it's like physiology, this is what is often used now. This body composition is actually based on the measurement of literally thousands of people, but this was back in the 1920s, and this was in the Czech Republic. So the average sort of man and woman back then, when they were aged between 20 to 24, they had this kind of breakdown, you know, X percentage muscle tissue, X percentage fat, and so forth. One thing to just bear in mind is if you look at the yellow and green bands there, you've got there's this concept of essential fat and non-essential. So essential fat is you need it. If you don't have it, you're not going to function well as a human being. If you're thinking about sort of changing body composition, then you're looking at your non-essential fat sort of percentage and how to alter that. Just as a little aside, you can kind of see, so the top, just where my cursor is, so the top numbers there, those are the average numbers from the 1920s. This is in the Czech Republic. And I just looked up what the average sort of height now is for a man and a woman in the Czech Republic. This was from 2001 sort of paper. And you can see there's been quite significant growth. So the average man has grown by 4 inches and the average woman has also grown by sort of 1.5 inches. So there's been quite significant sort of change. And I guess one of the main drivers for that was probably, probably nutrition, really, because I'm sure we've got far more access to sort of calories, protein than we did back in the 1920s. Right, next slide. Okay, so why eat protein? Well, it increases your muscle mass and strength, muscle mass and strength, and really it's the building block of us. So it's involved in everything: blood, skin, hairs, nails. You name it. There's going to be a little bit of protein in there. But that's probably quite obvious, but what's not so obvious maybe is that actually protein is fundamental for making the hormones in our bodies that basically control lots of the physiological processes. It accounts for the differences in the sexes in terms of our body composition. So men naturally probably have a little bit more body, muscle bulk and so forth, as you saw on the previous slide. And then another thing is it has a significant component in enzymes. So enzymes are things which basically help the body to perform sort of chemical reactions. So an easy example would be we have enzymes in our mouth called like maltase and amylase, and they help with digestion. So for example, if you chew some carbohydrate for long enough, it'll start to sort of taste sweet. And the reason for that is because it's getting broken down by those enzymes into sugars. So antibodies, that's something that's produced by the immune system to help fight off infection. Blood clotting, so you cut yourself and it starts to clot. Well, it's fibrinogen, that's basically a protein. So anyway, it's got lots of uses in the body. Obviously, the body can use it for energy if it wants to, but it doesn't tend to. Just one more slide on this. This is tying into the energy balance. There's quite a few studies that say that protein intake can be one of the levers that you can use to try and reduce your calorie intake, as well as impacting on sort of hunger feelings. And then also, we tend to think of bone, for example, as being just calcium, but actually a third of it is made from collagen, which is a protein. So a little bit about protein dynamics. Obviously, we're living tissues, and I think our tissues are always turning over. So the most obvious example probably would be the skin. So our houses get filled up with dust, and the reason for that is because we're shedding our skin all the time. So every sort of tissue in your body has a different turnover rate. So for example, for skin, it depends on the textbooks and so forth that you read in the papers, but roughly a month, your skin is completely different to the skin that you had a month earlier. So it happens for bone. So bone turnover is about 3 to 10% a year. The only sort of organ that doesn't really turn over in the body is actually the heart. So when it comes to muscle, so let's say the muscle in your thigh, for example, has changed. So in the course of a year, it can turn over twice minimum, really. So there's some papers that say that it might turn over 4 times in a year. So the muscle is completely different to how it was 6 months ago. So then just focusing on this slide, the purpose of this slide really is just to reinforce the point that basically protein is not, your muscle is not static. So there's something called the amino acid pool, which your body needs to make all the things that I was just talking about. So for example, enzymes and so forth. And it takes that pool basically from your muscle mass, from your protein source. So on the right over here, the protein, this represents the total protein mass of an individual who will probably weigh around 50 kilos, maybe 50, 60 kilos, because essentially we're about 20% protein. And you can see that in any given day, there's quite a lot going on. So you'll eat some protein, but you'll also be synthesizing, so making new proteins from the amino acid pool. And then at the same time, there'll be degradation. Things just get worn out. But the body's actually very good at using the amino acids. So you've got broken down proteins on the right. They move over to the amino acid pool, and then they get reused to rebuild things that the body might need. But every day, it's not a perfect system. So every day you will lose a certain amount of protein. And that comes out in the form of basically, well, you're shedding it out of your skin, for example, but also it's coming out in the form of urea in your urine. So this looks complicated, but the reason why I put it in is just to emphasize the fact that basically there's three, we're not talking about sort of micronutrients, just the macronutrients, so fats, carbohydrates, proteins. And essentially this thing at the bottom here, the citric acid cycle, just think of that as the energy cycle. So you can see these three main macronutrients feed into the energy cycle. So basically all three of these can be energy sources for the human body, though the body tends not to use sort of protein for energy on the whole, though it can do. So at a rested state, basically about 50%. So if you just sat there doing nothing, sorry, I'm just admitting somebody. So if you just sat there sort of not doing anything, then 50% of the energy that you're burning, so that would be called your basal metabolic rate. So 50% of the energy you're burning will come from fat, and then about 50% from carbohydrate. And basically protein will be contributing to it, but it'd be very notional, like 1% or something like that, 2%. And then if we look at energy states, so where you're actually exercising, protein and directly feeding into this energy cycle won't contribute more than 5% to providing energy to your system whilst you're exercising. Now, there's something, the human body seems to be incredibly metabolically flexible, if that makes sense. So you can change these sort of the energy usage in your body quite dramatically depending on what you choose to feed your body. So 5%, there'll be outliers, and somebody will be, using more than 5% of their protein for energy use. Yeah. Now, there's another thing that's probably not so well known, and it's kind of in a way demonstrated by this diagram. Because if you look here, you can see carbohydrates. Not a lot has to happen to it to feed into this energy cycle. Same with fats, not too much beta oxidation, not too much, and it goes into this energy cycle. But if you look here, on the protein side, there seems to be all this stuff going on, deamination and so forth. So what that is really is the cost, the energy cost of using protein for energy purposes rather than something else. So it's called the thermogenic effect of food. And basically for protein, about 20 to 30% of the energy within the protein actually has to be used to be able to access that protein for use as energy, if that makes sense. Whereas with the other macronutrients, so carbohydrate, about 5 to 10% has to be sort of used up in trying to access the energy source. And for fat, it's even less. So fat, you only end up using about 2% of the actual fat for kind of to break it up, basically. You need energy to break up the food to make it accessible to be used in this citric acid cycle. So that's just something that you may not have been aware of. It's quite interesting. I thought I'd add that in. Now, right, let's go next slide. So protein really, what we're interested when we eat proteins, to be honest, is amino acids. So amino acids are basically the building blocks of all proteins. So when we eat food or eat protein, whatever source it may be, vegetarian, vegan, doesn't matter, it'll get broken down into constituent amino acids. And thereafter, the body will then use those amino acids as it needs to build the proteins that we need. And there are 20 amino acids, and basically 9 of them are deemed essential. So what that means is that you can't, your body's it's very capable. So you can feed yourself carbohydrate, and from that carbohydrate, your body can make 11 amino acids. But unfortunately, there are 9 of these amino acids that the body just cannot fabricate itself. It has to get it in, by food and food alone. So these are them. They're the ones on the left. You don't really need to know much about them, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things really about them. So it's those 3 there. I'll just talk a little bit more about those 3. So there's this concept around complete and incomplete proteins, which sort of it's basically about the amino acid content. So there's this description about limiting amino acids, which basically means that, and this is found predominantly in plant-based proteins, it basically means that there's so little of this particular amino acid that it's not really feasible for you, in particular types of plant-based proteins. It's not really feasible for you to be able to get all you need from eating that particular plant-based food item, because you'd have to eat so much of it that it wouldn't really be possible. So of those essential amino acids, the ones you want to pay attention to, particularly if you are, more predominantly plant-based in what you eat, is lysine. So this is a limiting amino acid, and these are the groups of foods that it's found in. So cereal, grains, wheat, rice, nuts, and seeds. But it's absolutely fine because, it's absolutely fine because you can get lysine really from beans and legumes. So legumes are those things that I've listed: lentils, peas. Basically, it's the seed of a plant. So peas, chickpeas, soybeans, peanuts. So you can get all the lysine you need from beans and legumes. But beans and legumes lack this other essential amino acid called methionine. But that doesn't matter because actually the food substances above, so wheat, rice, nuts, and cereal, contain enough methionine. So really, the take-home point from this particular slide is that you just need to have a nice broad range of foods in your diet that are reasonably protein rich if you're vegetarian or vegan, and you should actually be able to get everything you need. Right, next one. So I mentioned this one. Leucine is just a point around this, is that this particular, all amino acids have slightly different functions. So some amino acids are actually used preferentially by the body for energy purposes, for example. But this particular amino acid, the evidence is pretty solid that it helps drive muscle growth. So you can have a very protein-rich meal, but if it doesn't have lots of this amino acid in it, then you won't get as much muscle gain as you would do if you had a bit more of this in your diet. So it's a good one to sort of be aware of. And later on, I kind of give you some resources to identify that. But I mean, I'm much more of a fan of just eating whole foods, really, rather than any kind of supplements. But if you were going to supplement anything, then you could supplement something called branch chain amino acids, and then you can get vegan and non-vegan sources of this particular protein, because this particular supplement is rich in leucine, and you can easily get what you need from supplementing from that. But I just recommend real food, to be honest. So there's one other point that you may not be aware of, and it's called this protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. And it is basically how readily available is the protein for my body to use. And generally speaking, vegetarian sources, vegan sources, it's a little bit harder for your body to extract the protein. So if you imagine 100% is set, is the marker over from the right, which is the caseinate, which is basically kind of like, it's a processed protein. So that's very readily accessible to the body. So 100% of what you eat will be absorbed by your body. So if you imagine that, that tells you the rest. So depending on the type of food item, you may, it may say, all right, if I eat 100, if I eat this, I'm supposed to get 20 grams of this food item, but hold on, I'm eating barley. Well, actually, I'm probably only getting 15 grams. So really, it's just something to be aware of. It might mean that you just have to, I suppose it's another sort of thing to say that you just have, if you're really looking to increase your protein intake, then you just have to be aware of it and to respond accordingly, basically. So back to this slide about this sort of the dynamics in protein. If you imagine what this slide showed was sort of the RDA allowance, which is the recommended daily allowance. So it's the kind of the protein intake that you need to sustain yourself. And that's typically set at 0.0 grams per kilogram of mass. So I'm using mass here because in theory, when we weigh ourselves and we get a kilogram, it's actually mass, but if you just think of it, 0.8 grams per kilogram of weight, but that's how we, you speak about it, amongst friends and family. So it's quite confusing because there's lots of, not contradictory stuff about how much protein we should take. So the numbers vary basically. So this is a website that I use because basically it's got lots of decent content. Some of you have to pay, some of you have to pay for, so I've got access to some of it. But this particular bit, you don't need access to it. And so what is examine.com? Well, it's a bunch of nutritionists and physiologists, basically a group of people who have got together and they decided to try and produce unbiased literature around topics without any kind of external influence. So basically, they're completely funded by people who access their service. So this is what they came up with. So this is for them. This after having read the literature, they said, right, optimal daily protein intake for adults in grams per kilogram of body weight, and you can see that they're stating that they're basically advising an RDA far greater than the 0.8. So you're looking at 0.8 versus some of these bigger numbers. So let's say if you're an active, so just to talk through this chart, for example. So let's say you're a healthy weight, so your BMI is 25, or let's say under 30, and you're active and you're really keen on muscle gain, gaining some muscle, then you should be eating anywhere between 1.6 to 2.4 grams per kilogram of protein. So you can see that's quite different to the next slide that I'm about to show. So this was done in 2017. This is when they talk about a systematic review, meta-analysis. What they're basically saying is that we've looked at all of the available evidence that we can find, and we've come up with a conclusion. And basically their conclusion was this: protein intakes at amounts greater than 1.6 grams per kilogram per day do not further contribute to gains in muscle mass. So you can see there's a bit of a spectrum, but I think there's definitely, from all the stuff that I was looking at, there's definitely a trend, particularly actually in the elderly group, to recommend additional protein intake. So often I've seen the number 1.2 grams per kilogram mentioned when you're talking about a protein intake for people that are older. I'm talking 65 and above, and that's to try and avoid sarcopenia, which is basically muscle wasting. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Oh, I forgot to let me just go back to the previous slide. Just at the bottom here, there's a link. So there's a protein intake calculator, which I've just, if you want to, you can access that. You can just key in your details, which is literally I'm male or female. This is my weight. I'm active. My body weight is considered healthy. That kind of thing. So you can find out for yourself. So protein, and these next series of slides really is just about pointing to you to what I consider sort of good resources, if that makes sense, just to get a concept of the protein in foods, if that makes sense. So I don't really want to read through it, but you just get a feel for things. Does that make sense? Just by looking at these things. So there's a book on the right here, 5-2 Diet Photos, which I bought for myself a few months ago. And if I just show you the next slide, it breaks down the food into this kind of pictorial diagram, so you get a sense of portion size as well as how many sort of what protein and calories is attached to the particular food item. So that's I thought that's quite useful. Then there's this particular website which also you do have to give in your email address, but it's actually a very useful website, because you just key in a particular food item, sort of pick the serving size, as it were, and then it will give you lots and lots of information about the food item. So, I was saying about how do you find out about the the essential amino acid content of your protein? Well, this website will do it for you if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. So now, when to eat. So if you've exercised, there seems to be, a fairly decent consensus that it's good to eat pretty much immediately after having exercised. So within 1 hour of having stopped exercising. And in terms of protein, they recommend between sort of 15 to 25 grams of protein after your sort of exertion. And that now the carbohydrate content that you would take would really depend on what level of exercise you've done. So obviously, if you've done a very long run, then you'd have to ramp it up quite a bit. But you get the idea that you want to add, I'm just focusing on protein, so you want to have about that kind of amount of protein. If you're thinking about sort of maintaining muscle mass, but also getting some muscle mass gains. So next point is, you may be aware of this, you may not be aware, but there's sort of advice out there which basically says that you can't really absorb more than 30 grams of protein per meal. But actually, there's a few dissenting voices out there, and really, where the disagreement has come is just from sort of the fact that the window of when they looked at the protein absorption wasn't long enough. Because if you look at the total sort of time, if you expand the time when you look at how long the body can absorb that protein from that meal from, then you find that the body can actually absorb more protein from one particular meal. And really, the way it does this is it actually slows down the rate of motility in your guts. So if you imagine your food, obviously when you eat it has to go into the stomach then churns it up, and then the stomach can then hold on to it, or then it can pass it on to the next part of your gastrointestinal tract. So actually what's been found in sort of more up-to-date stuff, or at least people are starting to talk about it, is that the body just basically sort of feeds through the protein at appropriate sort of time intervals. So the 30 grams of protein in a meal I don't think is that valid, because I mean, it's quite amazing how polarized the sort of the dietary debate is. So there are people out there who live on carnivore diet only, and literally they will eat one meal a day, and all they will eat in that meal is a very, very large protein meal of meat, or perhaps seafood as well. And they remarkably, certainly some of them anyway, they seem to be doing quite well on it. So it does call into the question this ability of absorbing. I wouldn't recommend the carnivore diet, by the way, but anyway, it certainly calls into question this idea that you can only absorb 30 grams, because these individuals aren't wasting away. Right. So that was the bits around sort of protein, and yeah, I'll stop there. So I guess if people want to ask me any questions, then please feel free to do so. Hello?
Hey, Chris.
Hi.
So your view on protein is pretty clear, like the importance of protein.
Yeah.
Do you have any view on just the balance of I guess, other foods in your diet, and in particular, I guess, what you eat like before exercise. So you take protein after exercise, but prior to exercise?
To be honest, I didn't actually, because there's actually a very good diet sheet that I can share with you for that. So I know it's all about sort of carbohydrate loading and so forth. So you don't need to take any protein before your meal. But in terms of carbohydrate loading, it really, the evidence is pretty clear that it is good to load up on carbohydrate before physical activity, particularly if it's going to be quite prolonged. So I'd say sort of 60 minutes and beyond. But you know, if you're going to engage in 30 minutes of physical activity, then really I don't think there's that much benefit. So in terms of how much you're going to load up, well, it really it sort of depends, to be honest, on the quantity of exercise that you're going to be doing. So, for example, I haven't got it in front of me, but just off the top of my head, if you're going to, for example, exercise for more than 2 hours in a day, 2+ hours, for example, then the advice, I don't completely agree with it, to be honest, but the advice suggests that you can load up with as much as 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of weight, which I think personally, it seems a little bit excessive. But I haven't looked into carbohydrate loading enough. But otherwise, you know, you could do like 4 grams would be perfectly adequate, something like that. So, for example, if you weighed 60 kilograms, that would be 240 grams of carbohydrate, that kind of ballpark.
Thanks. No, the links are great to look at that as well and kind of get a sense. I'm just scrolling through the attendees to see if anyone else has a question.
You still see the so if you go to this particular, if you go down to food facts, I think it's the British Dietetics Association, Food facts, if you go to that website, it's got some really good stuff. Particularly, there's a leaflet about sports nutrition. It's done nicely in like a 2-page summary, so that would be very useful.
I've got a question. What's your opinion on like Lucozade Sports and sports drinks? Do they give you the edge that all the adverts tell you about?
Well, again, I think that's just about that. To be honest, that's just about carbohydrate loading, really, because at the end, all you're getting is sugar. So it depends. I guess it's more readily accessible by your body because it's in pure sugar form. Does that make sense? So I don't buy into it particularly, no, because I think it's much better just to eat sort of whole foods, really. Yeah.
Sorry, could I ask a question?
Yeah, of course, please.
Broadly speaking, how do the ladies that you're involved with at Charlton Football plan kind of around the game day, their eating and that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, it's so they are encouraged to load up with some carbohydrates about 2 to 3 hours beforehand, but again, nothing dramatic. So, you know, somewhere in the order of about 200 grams. And hydration really isn't such an issue. So they're sort of advised just to, depends on the weather, obviously, because if you're looking at a very hot day, then they'd probably be advised to hydrate beyond sort of thirst. So generally you just advise to drink to, you know, levels of thirst, you know. So have access to drinks, and if you feel thirsty, you drink. But beyond that, you wouldn't really, worry too unduly. And then obviously post game, it's pretty much what I've said, which is they're encouraged to take a bit of protein on board as well as carbohydrate. And one of the sort of readily easy ways of doing that, it doesn't quite hit the 20-gram protein, but is actually often we sort of say just like chocolate milk. It's quite a good sort of, apart from the fact that it's probably not very good for your teeth, but it's actually quite a good thing to take after exercise.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
All right. How are we doing? Time. So the next, shall I move on to the next bit? Yep. Oh.
Go for it.
So I just this was a very interesting study, and I thought I'd kind of like sort of shoehorn it in. Well, not completely, because essentially, if you want to improve your performance, then a way of doing that really is looking at your body composition. And obviously, if you're carrying around excess weight in the form of adipose tissue, then you are probably just, slowing yourself down unnecessarily. So, if you can trim, let's say 2% of your body weight. In fact, there was a study which I just felt like it was getting too long, this whole presentation, so I pulled it. But, there's studies out there, and this study basically showed that even a 2% weight change makes a difference in terms of sprint speed. So over distance, is an American study, so over 20 yards, 40 yards. It's not complete, right, because you're unlikely to suddenly put on 2% weight, so there'll be adjustment in your muscle mass. But I guess that the idea around it, the concept around it, is sort of valid. So anyway, this study sort of incorporates this idea of this protein leverage hypothesis, and this is a sort of very interesting study because there's this unfortunate, we could almost describe it as a pandemic. I know in your group it's not going to be such an issue, but there's just a pandemic of people becoming more overweight as they grow older. And one of the things which sort of struck me, which might sound a little bit surprising, and I'm sorry I haven't got anything to back it up, but it's fairly well appreciated now, kind of within the sort of sports circles and so forth, that actually exercise is useful for weight maintenance and can help in weight loss, but you have to exercise so much to get the weight loss that actually for the recreational individual, it's kind of beyond them to be able to exercise so much. And the reason why that might be, in terms of not really losing dramatic amounts from exercising, is that it's you tend to compensate. So there's some studies out there which says, let's say, I've just done my 30-minute run, I've done my hour run, then your body just tends to actually do less. So you will end up basically doing less day-to-day activity without even realizing it, so that you expend a little bit less energy. Also, you may overcompensate for the amount of calories that you've lost, and you will say, I can deserve this treat. And so you very rapidly, sort of reduce any weight loss benefits from your exercise. So for me, that was quite a revelation. That was like one of the things I took away from my sports exercise medicine masters. And so obviously then that creates the problem of how on earth do you get people to lose weight? And so that's where this study comes in, which I thought sort of deserved to be known more, but it didn't really sort of make the headlines. And the reason why it didn't make the headlines is it doesn't sound on the face of it very impressive, because normally when you hear studies quoted in the paper, they talk about enormous numbers. There was this study with 10,000 people on it, and it showed X, Y, Z. So this study, though, should be taken seriously because it is a very well-controlled study, and it is what's called a randomized control study. So basically, the subjects were submitted to both kind of treatments, as it were, and it's only a small study, so 20 people. Their body mass index on average was 27, and their average age was around 30. So a fairly young group of people, and they agreed to be kept indoors for a total of 28 days, during which time they were very closely monitored in terms of how much energy they expended in terms of exercise, because they were encouraged to do some cycling, for example, and they were monitored in terms of exactly what they ate. So anyway, there were two diets offered to these individuals. So they got to have one diet for 14 days, and then they got to have the next diet for 14 days. And there were two groups. So at any one time, one of the group was on, the ultra-processed diet, and the other one was on the sort of unprocessed diet. And this bit here, ad libitum, basically meant that they were allowed to eat as much of the food as they wanted. So there was no restriction in terms of how much they were allowed to eat. So I've kind of covered the top bit there. The diet was matched. So basically what they did was they tried to match as much as possible the kind of the macronutrients. So they were served at the same amount of protein, fats, and carbohydrates. And then also, as you can see, sugar, fat, and fiber. And the finding was that in the ultra-processed diet, the same participants, obviously, because they went on to do the other diet, ate an additional 500 calories every day. So 500 calories is a lot, because the average man is supposed to have a sort of a calorie intake of about 2,500 calories, and a woman about 2,000. Those are the common numbers that are stipulated. And obviously over this time, their body weights did change. So this graph basically shows the difference in intake. So obviously the red line here is, you can see on average, it kind of fluctuated around the 2,500 calories a day intake. And that was on the unprocessed diet. And the blue line here, they were hovering more around the 3,000 calories intake. And obviously there was a weight change. So you can see that over 2 weeks on the ultra-processed diet, they tended to gain about 1 kilo. And then on the unprocessed diet, they tended to drop 1 kilo. So I've just pulled out a couple of the graphs from the slide, and I'm just going to talk through them. So if you imagine VAS, so visual analog score, so they're just given a scale, so it'd be 0 to 100, and they're just supposed to sort of tick, mark an X along that line as to where they, find themselves, if that makes sense. So, for example, satisfaction. So that means how pleasing did they find this diet? So they found both ultra-processed and unprocessed equally satisfying. So equally filling. It seemed to satisfy their hunger equally. So there was no statistical difference between these two diets in terms of how it made these individuals feel. Does that make sense in terms of food and so forth? Then bottom right-hand graph here. So this is basically how many grams of food. So that on the left here, this one here, how many grams of food they consumed per minute. And on the ultra-processed diet, they consumed more. So they were consuming more like 40 grams per minute of food, whereas in the unprocessed, they were consuming more like 30 grams, physical grams of food. Then looking on the right-hand side of this graph here, so it's sort of similar, but this time they were looking at calories. So how many calories were they consuming per minute? As you can see, there's quite a noticeable difference, bigger difference, 50 calories per minute versus 30 calories per minute. So in this paper, they were trying to understand why this might be. And they talked about how essentially I'll go on to sort of show you what ultra-processed foods are. But ultra-processed foods or processed foods, they tend to have had some kind of, firstly, mechanical work. So if you imagine, they'll have the fiber content will have either been stripped away as part of the processing, or the fiber will have been broken down and mechanically sort of shredded, which tends to make these foods a little bit softer, which means also that they are quicker to swallow because you don't have to chew them as much. And then the other thing that can happen with processing is that you end up essentially removing some of the water content from foods. So a very easy example of that would be comparing a potato to a potato chips or crisp. So the water content of the two is vastly different, but so you're concentrating the calories. So obviously it makes it easier to consume more calories rapidly. So Not 1 second. Right. So this, just going back to that idea of the protein leverage hypothesis, which was basically that your body will continue to eat until it has met its protein requirement for the day. So what's interesting about this is you can see that they pretty much bang on ate the same amount of protein, but quite noticeably different carbohydrate and fat intakes. So what I want to do now is I just want to actually show you, because I was quite shocked. I'm just going to go to the paper now, so I'm just going to pull out of this screen here and pull up the paper. So just bear with me 1 second. Where is it? It's here. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I was quite surprised myself as to what they considered processed food versus processed food versus unprocessed food. So I just want to show you and just encourage you to actually take a look at this as well. So this is the can you see? I presume you're seeing this now. Yeah. So this is the ultra processed menu. So I'll just scroll through about sort of 3 or 4 meals of this. So Honey Nut Cheerios, whole milk blueberry muffin. That's what it looks like.
So I think we're on a different page to you.
Damn, sorry. Here we go. How's that? Can you see me?
That's good, thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Sorry about that. First time doing this, so I just think it's useful. Well, it's really to encourage you to take a look at these pictures, to be honest. And I just want to show you a few of them. So that's the breakfast, so Cheerios, muffin, and so forth. This is their lunch, which I didn't think looked too bad personally. So beef ravioli, some white bread on the side, oatmeal raisin cookies, diet lemonade, margarine. Then we've got here steak, gravy, mashed potatoes, corn. You get the idea. So I'll just scroll down. Okay, one more breakfast. There's a croissant. There's some sausages, turkey sausages, and a blueberry yogurt. So now I'll just scroll down to the unprocessed food. So here we go. So this is the contrast, and you can see basically very little has happened to the food item, really. So you've got fruit there, it's been cleaned and it's been cut up. I know you've got a muesli there, but really the constituent parts are there. They've just all been pushed together. You've got some yogurt. Again, it's just really whole foods. Very little has been done to it other than being kind of cut up into pieces. Again, here you imagine there's lots of color on the plate. So anyway, the purpose of that was to just give you a feel, to be honest, of the difference between these two sort of processed and unprocessed. So I'll just go back quickly to the study and just to highlight, sorry about this. I'm just getting familiar with this. Why is it not working? Yeah. So there's this processing classification, just which may make it a little bit easier to comprehend. So you basically, it's called this NOVA classification, and really it sort of says, it makes it easier to conceptualize the processed and unprocessed. So unprocessed, as you can see, it's just plants and animals separated out from the bits you probably can't eat. Then you've got processed culinary ingredients, so that can be the things that you see, and also included in that would be herbs and spices. Then you've got processed foods, and I guess with processed foods, it just becomes a little bit, there's a little bit more work gone into that food item, and also it becomes a little bit less clear perhaps what that food item is made of. Obviously bread, we know it's made of wheat, but if you didn't know that bread was made with wheat, you may not be able to link wheat to bread, for example. And then you've got the ultra processed category, which is quite self-evident. It's basically got lots and lots of ingredients in it, and it doesn't resemble any kind of unprocessed food item. I think one of the take-home points for me is that if you look at that study and those foods that I just showed you, those pictures, most of those foods are actually more processed foods, to be honest, rather than ultra processed. But so I think my take home from that study is that you really want to just stay with unprocessed foods, cooked from scratch as much as you can, because that's quite a good way of kind of managing your calorie intake whilst also feeling satisfied. So yeah, that's it really. That's it. There's questions.
I do have a question actually, if I may.
Yeah.
There's just in terms of frequency of eating, I suppose meal size as well. I know a lot of top athletes, instead of eating, say 3 meals a day, they actually eat 5 smaller meals a day. Do you have an opinion on that, about what's actually useful?
I think I would not recommend that type of eating to somebody who isn't exercising. I think, if you're exercising, so for example, if you're, let's say you're an athlete, you want to obviously have a little bit of food beforehand and you want to eat straight after. So immediately you're looking at 4 meals, because let's say you've got your breakfast, then you've got your little bit of food after you've exercised, then you've got your lunch and your dinner. So you've got 4 meals right there. Do you see what I mean? Whereas that bit of nutrition after your exercise you've got to be, is something a little bit more, substantial than, let's say, a chocolate bar. Do you know what I mean? There's actually a meal there. So I think that there's no issue with that whatsoever. If you're a sports person, but if you're somebody who's sedentary and so forth, then I don't think you need to eat like that. I don't think there's any benefit really. But I think the main point really is it's what you eat that's also very important. That would trump how often you eat. So for example, if you look at fast digesting carbohydrates, it's stripped of fiber. You can digest that very quickly. I'd have to look it up, but there's quite a range of time that is spent digesting different food items. So, for example, if you were to eat for the sake of argument, let's say a fairly protein and fiber-rich meal, well, you'll still be digesting that meal up to 3 to 4 hours later. Whereas you contrast that to a very rapidly sort of digested food item. So something, for example, that could be something sugary. So let's say like Lucozade, or it could be chocolate bar or whatever, something like that. You've digested that within an hour, it's gone. So if you imagine the idea of eating the meals, it really, I think, depends on the food items as well. That would be more important, to be honest. But yeah, no problems with eating 4 meals a day. If you're exercising, I don't think that's much of an issue.
I have a question along those lines. So what you're saying is that if a diet that lacks in fiber, will that mean that you get hungry more often?
Yeah. So there is something called. I think, to be honest, if you're metabolically healthy, which all of you very likely are, then it's probably less of an issue. But if you're not metabolically healthy, then yes, you will probably get hungrier more quickly. So there's lots of theories around why we're getting overweight. So when it comes to ultra processed foods, this will take me about 2 or 3 minutes to explain, but basically there is a school of thought around, it's probably better done with slides, but I'll just try and describe it to you. If you imagine our bodies are governed by loads of factors, but one of those factors is hormones, and there are these hormones which impact on satiety, which is that feeling of being complete and not needing any more food. And basically, there's pretty decent evidence to say that one of the reasons why people tend to overeat ultra-processed foods is because your hormonal feedback mechanism is messed up by ultra-processed foods. And the reason why is because they're being stripped of fiber on the whole, and so they are readily absorbed into the body, and they're absorbed in the upper intestine, so the upper small intestinal tract. And there are a bunch of hormones that are released by cells at that point in your small intestine, okay? But what normally would happen is that food would actually make its way further down the small intestine to another area, which is lined by different cells. And those cells are hormone secreting cells, which produce a different type of hormone called PYY. And there's one other which I've forgotten the name of. But anyway, those hormones are the hormones which tell you you're full. So if you imagine the body has lost that feedback signal, if that makes sense, or some of that feedback signal. So that's why they're saying that you will probably overeat. And the other thing that happens, going back to your points, is very long-winded, apologies, is that though in the upper intestinal tract, the hormones that are produced, they basically encourage fat storage, which unfortunately is then not balanced out by the hormones which would have been secreted lower down your small intestinal tract. So there's a school of thought that says that actually more of that food is going to storage than would have done naturally. And then ergo, you may end up feeling hungrier because you never actually, as it were, use those calories for energy because they got stored away, if that makes sense, yeah? The other thing that can certainly impact, so that's a theory, and there's a guy who's done a nice presentation on it, and he's not alone. And there's the other thing is that if you strip out the fiber, as again it comes, your carbohydrates become readily digestible, and carbohydrates are all digested down to glucose. So then you get a big sugar spike. And then what can happen, because your body almost overcompensates, as it were, it doesn't realize when the peak of this sugar spike is going to come. So it basically floods the system with something to remove the sugar from your bloodstream, which is predominantly insulin, but it overcompensates. And so then you get your blood sugars go down quite rapidly and below where they would ideally like to be. And at that point, you then feel hungry and you want to eat again. So yes, there's a bit of that going on. Does that make sense? But if you're a healthy, fit individual, you're unlikely to have those rapid swings. Does that make sense? Of blood sugar, because your body's not going to get it wrong. Whereas when you become slightly metabolically unhealthy, so I'm talking about things like insulin resistance, then that kind of that scenario is more likely to happen.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Cheers.
All right, I have a question. Going back to metabolism,
Yes.
is there such thing as some people have a faster metabolism than others? So, there's always those people that eat a load of rubbish, don't do any exercise, but then stay really slim, and they say, oh, I've just got a fast metabolism or something. Is that an actual thing?
I think it is actually. Yes, it is. I'm not I don't have. Yes, it is. Yeah, because I don't know too much about this area, so I don't want to over-egg it. But yeah, that definitely is a thing. So if you imagine your basal metabolic rate will change depending on what partly your body composition. Your basal metabolic rate really is set by your muscle mass, your protein mass, and what is not immediately sort of apparent when you look at somebody is their body composition. So there is this term called TOFI, which is thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And there are some people who, by all accounts, look thin. So you'd measure their waist, they look thin. But actually, they have a very high fat percentage, which basically means that their protein, their muscle mass is reduced. Does that make sense? So there'll be a bit of that in play, if that makes sense. So these individuals I'm talking about, they tend to store a lot of fat around their organs, so it's not immediately transparent that they're actually, they have a high fat percentage. So there'll be a group of individuals like that who might not look like they're putting on weight, but actually what is happening is that they're actually putting on fat, but it's not sort of plain to see because it's intra-abdominal, it's within the abdominal cavity. So sorry, I'll probably come off the topic, but so they're different individuals, and some of them seem to be able to eat a lot and not put any weight on. So there's this TOFI group, so they might be a slight outlier in terms of, they don't look like they're putting on weight, but they actually are putting fat on. And then there's another group of people. Well, that goes back to my point about muscle mass, to be honest, because you just don't know the actual muscle mass percentage of people. So really, it's governed by your basal metabolic rate is governed by your protein mass. And the point of raising this TOFI is that you don't really know what somebody's sort of body composition is always just by looking at them. So there's that. But then also, your basal metabolic rate will downshift, so your body will downregulate processes dependent on how much you feed yourself. So you may have all heard of this yo-yoing effect, where people will go on a diet, they'll do well, but unfortunately they'll do it in a way that they don't find sustainable for themselves. So they might lose 10 kilograms, and then they'll put the weight on again, and sometimes they'll put on more weight than they lost. I don't know if that's a concept you've heard, but that's fairly common sort of concept. So perhaps something around that is to do with the basal metabolic rate, because your body will downshift, if that makes sense. So it will kind of decide, okay, I'm not going to look after the skin so much, I'm not going to look after my nails so much, and it will use less energy so that it can allocate resource to those things that absolutely have to happen. So you get this downshift in basal metabolic rate when you calorie restrict, and then there's a lag between your basal metabolic rate recovering again and your sort of, when you start to eat more, if that makes sense. So there are definitely shifts in basal metabolic rate, and there probably are people who have a slight sort of different rates, definitely. But I think that rate really is set by your protein mass. There's one condition called hypothyroidism, which will lower your basal metabolic rate. So you will gain weight when you become hypothyroid. So basically, the thyroid gland, it sits in your neck and it produces thyroxine. And thyroxine, I sort of describe it to patients as something that facilitates energy production. So I describe it as the oil within an engine of a car. So its presence really helps for the car to run more efficiently and produce more energy. So there are things out there definitely that can lower your basal metabolic rate. I'll stop now because I'm waffling.
No, thank you, and all very interesting. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you. I know we're over time. I don't know if anyone had any last questions. But
yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, no.
Your evening back. But we should probably wrap it up and just say a huge thank you again for your time and for all the info.
Yeah, great. No, thanks for inviting me along.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thanks, Carl, for organising as well.
Oh yeah, do you guys want these slides? I can give them to Carl and pop them in Dropbox or something and share them with you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. I can put them up in our group.
Yeah, all right. They're a little bit crude and rough and ready, but at least you'll have the links and so forth. All right, then. Thanks.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Chris.
All right.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks, Bunny. Thanks, guys, for coming.
you.
Thank you.
Hang on, Chris, you're gonna have to make me host again. Actually, I'm gonna,
All right. How do I do
all right,
that?
I've done it. I've sorted it out.
Hmm.
All right, guys. Thanks for coming, Chris. Appreciate it, mate.
Oh, you're welcome. How do I do this hosting thing?
It's all right. I've sorted it. Don't worry.
I have. All right. Cool.
Thanks, guys. See you later. I'll give you a call after this, Chris.
Yeah. All right. Cheers. Bye.